Imagine dreaming of making games for a living, and maybe you find yourself chasing that dream right now. Today's story is a fascinating story where the indie dev dream was achieved and then ripped away, leaving a viral hit game that was forgotten about. Welcome to the Indie Dev Campfire. This is where we share stories from the world of indie game development, and this is the story of Loop Hero. The developers of Loop Hero can be traced back to 2014, where they took part in their first Ludum Dare game jam. They began operating under the name of 4 Quarters, and this would be the game jam that would define their future as game developers. Our determined game devs would go on to take part in 14 Ludum Dare jams over the next 7 years. What is Ludum Dare? Ludum Dare is a game jam that happens twice per year, where developers must create a game over the course of a weekend that fits a theme, and this theme is selected by the community in the weeks leading up to the event. Eventually, they'd get to the point where they realised they'd spent years developing games. They'd been taking part in game jams, but they'd only commercially released one game. Like many of us, they felt like they had one calling in life, to be full-time indie game developers. And to quote the devs, they felt like it was their one passion and their single talent. Making games was the only dream that they wanted to chase. During their years of making games, they'd constantly get together and brainstorm ideas for projects they could work on together. So, when in 2019, the team decided to take part in the Ludum Dare 45 game jam. They were hit with the theme, Start with Nothing, which they mulled over for hours, and they couldn't come up with a single decent idea. Eventually, they'd recall one idea that they had discussed around 6 months prior. It was an idea for a game where a hero walks around a road in a looping fashion, with the only input being from the player who designs the environment around the hero. Throw into the mix that the hero starts with nothing, and voila! They had a game idea that suited the game jam theme. But they were about to encounter a problem that I'm sure 99% of us have faced. 4 Quarters hadn't started work on this game prior to the game jam. In fact, all they had were some written ideas and mental notes from the conversation about the Loop Hero game idea. It's 2019, and our developers have been building games for 5 years, and they had a bucket load of games which they hadn't finished. Projects that were overly ambitious and left to gather dust in the dark reaches of their hard drives. Therefore, they knew that if this project was to see the light of day, they had to play to their strengths. As a team of 4, they knew that they had to be realistic with their goals. If they didn't, their Loop Hero idea would be just that, another idea that never made it into being a game. They had 3 days to build their game and present it to Ludum Dare. And they failed. They had tons of passion and ideas for the game, but they also had missing features and a shitload of bugs. So ultimately, they missed the Ludum Dare deadline. They overshot with their ambitions, and they couldn't bring the game into a working condition in time. But this didn't hold them back. They continued to pour hard labour into their game, and they had a special feeling about this game. Something made it different from all the other projects they had built together. Eventually, the demo for Loop Path Hero was released on itch, and it wasn't the resounding success that Loop Hero would eventually become. This was a very bare-bones game. It was merely a prototype of what would become Loop Hero's core gameplay. It was totally missing all the features that would eventually make it become a game that made you say, just one more run? You could send your hero on a quest, you could kill monsters, you could get loot, and you could place tiles. But that was kinda it. There was no story, there was no meta progression, and ultimately there was nothing really to keep the player engaged or hungry to come back again. And this was a massive problem, one that they knew they had to find answers to. Otherwise, this would be just another game sitting in Steam's deep abyss. With Loop Path Hero released, players could check it out and play it on itch.io, and the response was pretty positive. The developers recall struggling to explain the game to friends, and when showing off their first gameplay trailer, they had an audience who were interested, but they had no idea what the game was about. This was a result of their decision to go against so many typical gameplay conventions. Rather than directly engaging in battle and combats, the player was responsible for building the world around the hero. Then, players could watch the result of their creations. Once people were able to finally get their hands on the demo of Loop Path Hero, they understood the hook straight away. The devs got tons of feedback, but there was one thing that was said repeatedly. "You should build a bigger game," sprinkled with a few comments of, "I wanted more," which is exactly the sort of response that we crave as game devs. But, as already mentioned, Loop Path Hero was nothing more than a prototype. It was a bare bones version of what would later become Loop Hero. There was no meta progression, there was no story, and there was no replay value. There was just one quest, a few items, and a single hero. So, to satisfy the early adopters of Loop Hero, how do you go about building a bigger game? Well, Dima, one of the 4 devs behind Loop Hero, had a brilliant solution. Let's just add a camp. Yeah, those were his words, but he did say it in Russian. The idea of adding a camp was the building blocks of turning this 30-minute prototype into a game capable of hooking players for 10, 30, or even 100 hours, which is something that a lot of AAA studios fail to achieve these days. But that's another subject. Speaking of changing the subject, if you're enjoying this video, could you like it? Thanks, pal. Our developers at 4 Quarters are preparing to launch their game commercially. After collecting a ton of feedback and praise from their itch.io demo called Loop Path Hero, they are preparing the launch of their flagship title, Loop Hero. They added more playable classes, they expanded the items and cards the player could find, and they even added a camp. This was the roguelike meta progression that they had spoken about. And the prediction was correct. This meta progression was the spice that they needed to hook players in for hours upon hours, making Loop Hero a game that made you sit up to 3 AM saying, "Just one more run." With the Steam Games Festival on the horizon, now was the perfect time for our developers to prepare the next demo for the public. But this time they did meet the deadline. Once again, they spent hours and hours watching players go through the game, interacting with systems in unexpected ways, finding bugs, and breaking the game with ridiculous exploits. And from this, they took notes for their eventual release build. But instead of fixing exploits and crunching numbers, they decided to go down a different road. They added penalties to strategies. This would make players weigh up their decisions based on the pros and cons of their tactics. This is how we ended up with harpies spawning after the player builds a mountain, or how wooden warrior villages appear after you place 10 forest cards. Basically meaning that if you wanted to enjoy the benefits of, let's say, the forest card, you'll need to deal with the wooden warriors as a consequence. And this is part of the appeal of Loop Hero. Loop Hero is a game with a very interesting and unique gameplay loop, but it's also a game smothered with options for the players. There's an abundance of tactics to develop and secrets to discover, and the developers knew this would keep players hooked. But just how much interest did Loop Hero gather? In short, it gathered a lot of interest. If that's all you came for, then there's your answer. But something that I've not mentioned yet is the very smart decision that the devs made after releasing the Loop Path Hero demo. Since they decided Loop Hero would be their next commercial release, they began searching for a publisher straight away. You see, the devs at 4 Quarters knew that they seriously lacked marketing skills. And with time being the golden resource for all indie devs, they didn't want to spend theirs worrying about marketing the game and producing translations. Eventually, their plan would come together as they struck a publishing deal with Devolver Digital. Then, after releasing the game in March 2021, Loop Hero would reach 500,000 sales in only its first week. It was the first major indie hit of 2021, totally surpassing everyone's expectations, and only took Loop Hero 9 months to hit the landmark of 1 million sales. But the devs were absolutely not ready for the success of the game. This resulted in our 4 developers working non-stop for the first few weeks, resolving issues in a game that they classed as polished. But when tens of thousands of people are playing your game simultaneously, small bugs that only happen 1% of the time are now witnessed by thousands. The pressure from the game's release was relentless. Players would be doing everything to get the attention of the devs to fix issues or even just to answer questions. And we indie developers spend so much time chasing our dream scenario of striking gold with our games, that we often don't stop to consider if we're prepared for what is to come, and that's why the story of Loop Hero is so interesting, because they weren't prepared to stop at bug fixing. They were super eager to release new updates to Loop Hero, updates that would see more classes added and more overall depth and flavour in the game, and one could speculate that this means more cards, more items and an expanded campaign, but sadly, those plans would be derailed. At the time of recording this, we are in May 2024, almost 2 years after the last major update came in June 2022. The devs have spoken about the future of the game sparingly, and development has been very slow, with the conflict in Eastern Europe escalating in 2022, and the Loop Hero developers being based in Russia, certain complications would arise. For a start, Western sanctions on Russia would stop developers from being able to withdraw earnings from Steam, and we can interpret this as meaning that it was no longer financially viable to continue working on Loop Hero. This led to the developers telling gamers that if they couldn't find a way to buy the game, that they should raise the pirate flag, whatever that might mean. A developer post on Discord from December 2023 spoke about how difficult the last couple of years have been, with the political situation affecting a large number of studios in Russia and totally derailing all work on any future content. While Loop Hero was a viral success, it may not have been everybody's cup of tea, I get that. Personally, it's one of my favourite games from the last 4 years, but the saddest part of this whole tale is how Loop Hero has become a game that comes up in conversations, followed by someone usually asking, "Oh yeah, what happened to that game?" It's the viral hit that we all forgot, and for very tragic circumstances. Now, first and foremost, hopefully the developers are all safe and I hope they're doing well, and hopefully the game has a future. I know many of us really enjoyed conquering the looping roads, and to quote the early adopters of Loop Path Hero, we just want more.